The rain sliced through Berlin that night like a cold knife, finding every exposed patch of skin and drenching my coat until it clung to my back. Streetlights smeared their yellow halos onto the asphalt, and every footstep echoed my disappointment. There was a pathetic poetry in it, me, soaked through, clutching a battered manuscript, rejected again and again. I must have looked absurd beneath the overhang outside the Kreuzberg Gallery, dripping on the welcome mat while couples with noses in the air swept past, hardly sparing me a glance. A security guard eyed me, then closed the glass door so the storm wouldn't find its way inside. I'd barely set foot in that gallery. It was their last polite rejection, an email, of course, delivered without warning while I waited in the lobby with my hopes like precious baubles in my bag. Dear Herr Hoffman, thank you for your submission. At this time we regret, and the rest I didn't need to read. Both the manuscript and my pride felt limp in my hands. Berlin had never pretended to love me, not even before I'd started calling myself a writer. I'd grown up on the edge of Neukölln, in a saggy apartment where my mother swore daily that poetry was for poets, and poets starved. My uncle, a real estate agent, loved to toast his own success with sour schnapps at every family gathering, his meaty hand on my shoulder squeezing. Find real work, Paul, stories don't pay your rent. Dreamers die in this city. My sisters laughed too, though less cruelly. My struggles embarrassed them. I'd made a word into a wound. But tonight, standing in the puddle beneath that closed door, I was bone-tired, and I felt every stifled laugh from my childhood pressing back for air. I started walking, the manuscript pressed to my chest as if it meant something. I could say my neighbors were kind. Mostly they watched through cracked windows as I came and went. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined them whispering about that strange man who thought he could string words together and make sense of the world. The tram home was almost empty. My reflection in the window was a waterlogged ghost, the ink on my manuscript bleeding into my hands. I pressed my forehead against the glass to cool the rising fever of shame. Back at my apartment, I peeled off my wet coat and dropped the manuscript onto the kitchen table. The radiator ticked faintly. There was no food in the refrigerator, just a limp cucumber and a shriveled wedge of brie, both relics of a time when I'd pretended I could host dinner parties for friends who never came. I poured myself a glass of tap water and read over the rejection again. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors. The words rattled in my chest. I slept poorly, tossing on the hideous orange couch I used for a bed. The story I'd written, a labyrinthine thing about loss, stubborn hope, and a city that never cared much about either, felt heavy. At 3 in the morning I hauled myself out of bed, opened my laptop and started revising, erasing whole chapters, adding new scenes, stealing lines from the ache in my bones. It hurt less than despair. 3 months went by like that. I submitted to more publishers, more galleries, more competitions. Sometimes I received a form email, sometimes nothing at all. The city outside my window softened from sleet to thaw, and dirty snow melted on the cobblestones. Every morning I walked along the canal, rehearsing sentences in my head, conversations with invisible friends. Once at my mother's kitchen table, my uncle nodded at my empty hands. Still chasing fairy tales, Paul? His voice filled the room and my mother winced. Yes, I said, still chasing fairy tales. He barked a laugh. Well, let us all know when one of them catches you back. I nodded, though my teeth ached from the effort, but I kept going. There is a defiance in the slow drag against disappointment, as if every failure only sanded me to something sharper, harder at the edges. Eventually, the answers changed. One email arrived bearing a publisher's unfamiliar name, and I nearly deleted it alongside the spam. Instead, I read the subject line twice. We'd like to publish your novel. At first, I suspected a cruel joke, but the letter was real. An editor from a small imprint loved my story and wanted to meet. I went to their office, still half disbelieving. The building was nothing like my rejections. Here, battered books lined the shelves, the paint flaky, yes, but the air thick with the scent of coffee and ambition. The editor, Clara, was brisk. She said little and smiled rarely, but she looked at my story with a kind of gentle hunger. We'll need revisions, she said, tapping her pen, but you have something true. When I left the office, the sky had opened. Spring was honest and blue above the rooftops. I stood at the corner staring up, letting the light blind me a little. This was what it felt like to be chosen. The work that followed was brutal. I learned to excise scenes I'd grown to love and untangle sentences until they were spare and gleaming. Clara called me in twice a week, pushing me harder than anyone ever had. Sometimes I cried halfway home, frustrated and spent, but my feet always turned back to the page. My family hardly noticed at first. My mother sometimes asked about those little stories, and my uncle made less noise, perhaps deciding that silence was easier than sneering. My sisters sent reminders for birthday gatherings but never mentioned the book. The novel took shape, lean and angry and desperate for air, much like the city where I'd built it. When it went to print, I stared at the cover so long that the letters blurred and rearranged themselves. To celebrate, Clara took me to lunch and I barely tasted the food. All I could think was, this is real. I've made something no one can take from me. The book found a strange, stubborn life. First, a few reviews quiet, not all glowing, but one called it a startlingly honest debut from a voice that refuses to be silenced. My name in print, even if spelled wrong once, looked like someone else's destiny. Slowly, the reviews gave way to readers. Messages trickled in, then came in waves. Young people from Newcastle, expatriates, the bruised and the tired and the homesick wrote to me. They said, "Your story is mine," and I believed them. A year crawled by and my life became almost respectable. There were interviews and readings, invitations from places I'd once only peered into from the edges. I bought a new coat, something dry and smart, and when my publisher invited me to a festival in Vienna, I laughed out loud. People who'd tracked mud into my dream now regarded me with quiet curiosity, as if success granted me the necessary paper to join their club. Berlin, I realized, would never quite love its children. It demanded proof on a grand scale, but I had proof now, bound, stamped and read. My mother kept a copy of my novel on the shelf between family albums, spine out as if it might bite. My uncle avoided discussing it at gatherings. The friends who had melted away during the lean years reappeared with stories about loving my early style, as if they'd known I'd succeed all along. For months, I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the city's folds and not come back. But the publisher had arranged something impossible, a launch for my second novel at the same gallery that had kept its doors closed in the rain years ago. I didn't say no. In some corner of my restless heart, I wanted them to see, the doubters, the distracted, the ones who watched behind curtains and sipped their contempt like cheap wine. I wanted them to feel it, the reality of what I'd done. When I arrived that evening, Berlin's sky was sullen, but it held back the rain. Neon spilled from the gallery windows, illuminating a crowd already gathering near the entrance. I wore the new coat, my hands dry and steady. Clara caught my eye and gave me a small, rare smile. Inside, framed prints of the new book's cover lined the walls. Stacks of novels, glossy with fresh ink, perched on every table. A line snaked toward the dais where I'd soon read an excerpt. Glasses of white wine flashed, and then I saw them, my family, uncertain but present, crowding near the back. My uncle's suit was lumpy, his eyes wary. My mother twisted her wedding ring. My sisters leaned together, almost merging into a single nervous figure. Other faces from the old neighborhood dotted the corners, some I had known as playmates, some as critics. I stood on the dais and read, my voice trembling at first, then writing itself. The passages I chose were not gentle. I spoke of rejection, of a family that watched from sidelong glances, of a city that never promised warmth. The audience was silent, reading every word from my face. When I finished, the applause startled me. Clara's hand on my shoulder steadied my nerves. I watched as people filed past, asking for signatures, saying they'd been moved, that they'd seen themselves in my stubborn narrator. Each voice was a stone in the cairn I'd spent years building. My uncle approached, slow and heavy-footed. For a moment, I saw the man as he'd always been, someone for whom the world was a ledger, every success tallied, every dream a risk to be avoided. "Well," he said, glancing at my mother as if seeking permission, "you did it, Paul. Looks like the fairy tale caught up to you." He thrust his chin upward, a challenge or perhaps an awkward nod of pride. "It did," I said, unable to hide my defiance but also my relief. I realized I didn't need his approval, I'd survived its lack. He reached for a book, flipping through pages with care he'd never shown before. "You wrote all this?" "Yes," I said, "every line." My mother touched my arm, her eyes glassy with something complicated. "It's beautiful, Paul. I didn't know you had all these worlds inside you." I nodded, unsure what to say. We both knew she meant more than the pages. I wanted to gather her in, to forgive the years of tightening belts and narrowing expectations, but I only patted her hand. Later, as the gallery emptied, I stood at the window, watching the evening descend. Outside, the city glittered, trams on their tracks, night buses collecting the lonely, cafes still alive with argument and laughter. I remembered that first long walk after my rejection, rain dripping from eaves, and the shivering hope I'd nursed to life when no one else had believed. Behind me, my uncle's laughter rumbled as he recounted to a friend, "That's my nephew there." The writer, yes, the one in the papers. I watched their faces as they turned to see me, recognized in their eyes a baffled mixture of pride and confusion. For perhaps the first time I did not flinch from their gaze. I thanked Clara. I shook hands, accepted embraces, endured photographs. In every embrace, in every lingering look, I felt something change, not just their understanding of me, but my understanding of myself. Night let itself into the gallery like a patient guest. I slipped outside, the city suddenly familiar again. The street, washed clean from old rain, shimmered beneath my shoes. I walked slowly, letting the silence fill me. Berlin was still uncompromising, still indifferent as stone, but I had brought something home, a battered heart stitched whole by failure, fear, and every laugh at my expense. I strolled past the old canals, beneath windows where parents put children to bed, and caught my own reflection, faint but whole, in the water. Not a ghost this time, but a man returned to his city, carrying proof in his hands, not only to show them but to know it for himself.